Hello, welcome to MJR RPG, a podcast for tabletop, role-playing game reviews, replays, etc., etc. This is the second part, day 2, of the narrative replay for the Japanese Call of Cthulhu scenario, Kamigami wa Denshi Droga no Yume o Mirika, or The God's Dream of Digital Drugs, written by Byoushin, of the INT no Gisei Shataku, or Victims of INT group. If you haven't listened to the first part, I suggest doing so. You can also find links in the show notes to the written version on mjrrpg.com. Warning that this replay is full of spoilers. If you are at all wanting to play this scenario someday, I'd suggest not listening any further. And now, on to Do God's Dream of Digital Drugs, Day 2. A jittery Akira fast walked to the hospital. He'd barely slept and cruised on a liter of coffee. It had taken most of the night and morning to recover any data at all from Asahi's phone, but he'd done it. Itsumi likewise felt a tad haggard on his commute, having spent more time than planned the night before researching the 4 deceased and their organizations. True, fresh clarity never meted Daiki in the morning anymore, but he also didn't feel like death, so he took that as a sign of a good sleep. When Majima left the hospital, an eye patch covering the mess that still itched despite the painkillers, he found his companions outside comparing notes, already planning their routes for the day. Majima shook off any suggestions he rest and leave it to them. Without further ado, Itsumi laid out what he learned of the victims and decided who would go where. The first body, found a full month ago, had been that of Sakurako Akasawa, a professor at Yugoshi University and a leading member of their artificial intelligence lab. While the university had campuses all over Tokyo, the AI lab was near Jinboucho Station. The second to die had been Chikura Takuto, a sound engineer at Misayan Record, an audio equipment manufacturer located next to Ueno Park. After that was Baden Tallman, a German national and Japan representative for the international investment company Penture Co. Limited, headquartered in a tower attached to Shinjuku Station. Kanakura Saya had been the last victim before Masahi, a senior employee of the Shibuya-based event planning agency Chala Inc. Akira obviously knew the most about computers, and had even attended Yugoshi for a short time, so he volunteered to visit the AI lab. It likewise made sense for Majima, as a musician, to ask around Masayan Record. Itsumi took Penture and Daiki Chala to finish things off. Before they parted ways, agreeing to keep in touch and sharing anything they'd discovered in a group chat, Akira shared what he'd recovered from Masahi's phone. Not much, just message history. But among the texts was one anonymous message, telling him to be careful around the non-believers until the reveal. On his way to the Yugoshi AI lab, Akira searched a bit more into Professor Akasawa, learning that she had been the lead developer of a project called Partita, billed as a deep learning AI set to autonomously seek out the answer to the question, what is good music? Assistant Professor AI was now listed as the project lead. When he entered the lab room, the engineers, programmers, and assistants looked up at him, and once again Akira bowled ahead, asking for Assistant Professor AI. A risky lie, as AI might have been working closely enough with Akasawa at the time to know anyone on the team, but the assistant professor made some affirmative noises and sighed at Akasawa's name, saying he missed working with the professor. Akira probed further, and AI seemed more than happy to reminisce about Professor Akasawa, saying she'd been a genius, and that Partita would have never pulled through without her leadership and talent. He'd taken her suicide hard. To pull the assistant professor out of his darkening mood, Akira prompted him about Partita's work, and AI quickly lightened up, beaming with pride, and said Partita was hard at work on a follow-up piece already. In a lower, jokingly conspiratorial voice, AI said he shouldn't be sharing that, but Tristan, the first piece composed by Partita, would be revealed soon at the HMF anyways. Asked if he'd heard Tristan, AI sadly admitted he had not, and that Akasawa had expressly forbid anyone from the lab from listening to it. As far as he knew, only Akasawa and other members of the HMF committee had heard it. With a slight grin, Akira asked if there was perhaps a copy of Tristan still in the lab, but I just laughed and said it had been wiped from Partita. He had no idea if Akasawa had other copies made or where they might be. Deciding that was as far as Akira would learn, he excused himself and went to the server room, once again without any trouble. With the servers humming around him, Akira plugged in his laptop. Even a brief glance at Partita boggled the mind with its complexity, and indeed it was learning and creating. Normally this would fascinate Akira, enough to make him contemplate applying to work at Yugoshi right this minute, but he'd seen what Partita's creations had done. Tristan killed Masahi, blinded Majima, and quite possibly kill this Professor Akasawa as well. Akira got to work. Before heading into Chala Inc., Daiki checked their website, finding that the company had been contracted to plan and coordinate the HMF. Seeing that appointments were required, Daiki made one through the site. Outside the Shibuya office, Daiki noticed that posters were pasted to the windows, reading "Cancel HMF," and bearing a logo he recognized from Masahi's condo as being that of the Church of Serialism. As soon as he entered the office, a receptionist guided him to a small conference table. Another minute later, and a bleached-haired young man sauntered in, silver earrings flashing almost as brightly as his slightly vacant smile. He introduced himself as Kenji Chadashima, with an aloof bow, and settled sideways into a chair next to Daiki. Kenji proved more than happy to explain anything to Daiki, being one of the few employees not incredibly busy with preparing for HMF, especially after Kanakura passed away. Kenji's mouth turned into an almost comical frown. Daiki asked how Kanakura was involved with the HMF, and Kenji said that a few months ago, Kanakura had gotten a call regarding an AI project. Weird, he thought at the time, as Chala had never really been involved with anything like that before. But Kanakura said it would turn HMF into an event never to be forgotten, and no doubt guarantee Chala steady contracts for decades. Speaking of HMF, Kenji asked, "Are you going? It's gonna be crazy. There's a special event, you know. Real secret." He waggled his eyebrows until Daiki asked what the secret was. "Oh, when you put it like that, I just gotta tell ya. There's gonna be a gig, a song made by an AI. They call it Tristan, right? Weird." With a secretive glance around the room, the tiny, single closed-door room, he continued, "No one's heard it here, besides Kanakura." Daiki replied that he indeed was going to HMF, and that he really needed to get access to Tristan. There was something dangerous going on. Kenji, the gentle soul he was, trusted Daiki immediately, and quickly gave him Chala-branded backstage passes, saying that they'd help him get around the event without any difficulty. Regarding Tristan, it was with a different department, and Kenji honestly had no idea where or with whom. With so many staff busy, he couldn't promise anything, but he'd look into it right away and call Daiki if he found anything. Daiki thanked him and left for a smoke. Itsumi bussed to Pencher's Shinjuku office. On the way, he checked some news releases regarding the investment company, finding that it generally involved itself in tech-related ventures. Notably, it had funded the Ugoshi University AI Lab, publicly endorsing the music composer program Partita, hoping it would usher in a new era of both music and AI-generated content. Pencher's office took up a full floor of the office building, and stepping out of the elevator, Itsumi found a short hallway with a code-locked door and an elderly security guard. The pensioner apologized, saying that Itsumi would need an appointment, and that likely wouldn't happen anytime soon. When asked about Partita, the silver-haired guard said that the person in charge of the project was swamped with handling complaints due to all the threats. With a little extra pressing, he admitted that the staff member went home just before the last train each day, and might be able to talk briefly on the walk from the office to the station proper. With little else to do but wait, Itsumi decided to go check out the Church of Serialism, located near Jiyugaoka Station. Waiting for the train, he found that the church's website said it was devoted to worshipping the god of music. Business registry sites also showed that the church financed various live houses, concert halls, as well as sound equipment and recording companies. Altogether, the church seemed to be entirely peaceful, and even a rather successful business, with no history of incidents up until the threats against the HMF. And just as he got seated on the train, a news article dropped in his feed. 2 hours earlier, police had raided the church, arresting the whole of the congregation. By the time Itsumi got there, an altogether nondescript building that fit in with most offices around it, only a pair of officers stood outside. After telling them that he was off duty doing some extracurricular work for Detective Gakuto, they let him in. The worship hall was empty, scattered papers on the floor, and there was only a single door at the back of the hall. Itsumi rifled through the papers, finding them to be scriptures, most detailed serialism's devotion to the god of music and promoting musical art among all of humanity. Harmless. But there were also freshly printed pamphlets, prophesizing the descent of the god of music to Earth to banish the devil's music. The writing was sloppy and nearly incoherent in places, but Itsumi pieced together that the serialists thought Tristan represented the devil's music, and the congregation had to defeat it. There also seemed to be some division among the church, with the new scriptures denouncing heretics. Stacks of sheet music stood near pews. Itsumi couldn't work out the notes, they seemed absurdly complicated, so he snapped a picture and put it in the group chat. He went through the back door, finding a small office littered with binders and records. Pouring through well-laid-out finances and registration papers, Itsumi found that he recognized many of the church's members as popular musicians. Others were listed as HMF staff, moles. There had been plans for the church members to attend HMF at 1 p.m. and conduct a performance. Like a flash mob, he thought with a smirk. But the mass arrest did not bode well for the serialist's plan. He also dug through a members list, finding a dozen or so names crossed out and marked as excommunicated. Masahi Hamamatsu among them. Majima sat in the waiting room of Masayan Records. The receptionist has said their employees were all quite busy at the time. While keeping tabs on the others' progress, he'd passed the time searching about Masayan. Right on the corporate family page, the Church of Serialism was listed as a majority shareholder, the rest of the company being either family or employee held. The picture of the serialist sheet music in the group chat caught Majima's eye. The notes fell into place, and he could hear it in his mind's ear. Mysterious, beautiful, and terrible. Echoes from the end of the universe, disrupting his thoughts, ambitions, his very sense of being, until Majima was not Majima. Only more notes drifting in the eternal song. He hummed. The receptionist's scream snapped him out of it. She stood, her chair tipped over, hands covering her ears, eyes bugging out. They stared for a moment. Then Majima awkwardly shrugged an apology. New song. Rough draft. A man in a black AC/DC shirt, stretched by bulging muscles, his head glistening bald, strode into the room. He looked at the receptionist as she shakily took her seat. Then with a frown walked over to Majima and bowing, introduced himself as Den Otuishi. He apologized for the wait. He was busy with HMF prep. Pretending to be interested in purchasing equipment, Majima told Den he was a pianist, intriguing the big man, who suggested they jam sometime. He shredded. With assurance they would, for sure, soon, someday, Majima then worked into some more pressing questions, firstly about the Church of Serialism. Then said the serialists didn't involve themselves in Masayan's operations, and none of them worked for the company. Den had never even met any of them. Dream shareholders, really, never complaining or making demands. When asked about Takumi Chikura, Den clammed up for a second, but eventually let out a deluge. He didn't know how to feel. He liked Takumi, certainly never wished any harm to the guy, but now that he was gone, Den had been promoted. But he was also so much busier now having to handle HMF. But he got paid so much more now though. But he still had nightmares. Takumi at his desk, nodding along to whatever played in his earbuds, all the while stuffing pen after pen into his eyes, mouth, ears. Asked about the music, Den shrugged. The people from Chala had collected it. Confidentiality, or something. But Den still thought the music had something to do with Takumi's death. Majima thanked Den for his time and promised to call in the jam session. Den shredded his air guitar. The four met up as it was nearing midnight, Akira coming in last. He left a virus in Partita that would cause the program to cannibalize itself. If all went as planned, no one would notice until the crippled Partita ceased up, and without Professor Akasawa, they shouldn't be able to repair or rebuild it. After some talk of what to do next, they decided to first catch the Pentra employee, Kyoko Shachikuda. They ran into her as she hustled to the station, trying to ignore them until Daiki caught her attention as a fellow overworked soul, used to catching the last train. Kyoko said she'd answer some questions, as long as he could keep up and she wouldn't miss her damn train. In the end, they didn't learn much new from her. Pentra invested in all manner of projects around the world, and dozens in Japan. She didn't know much about Baden's death, just rumors he'd done it with his own fingernails. Too tired to care, too busy. Kyoko had been dealing with constant claims, complaints, and threats from that damn church. At least that should get easier now that the bastards had been arrested. Midnight approached. They had some idea what would happen tomorrow. Tristan would play at HMF. All those in attendance, all those watching it across Japan, all those streaming it internationally, they would all hear Tristan, and no doubt react just like Sakurako Akasawa, Takumi Chikura, Baden Tallman, Saya Kanakura, Masahi Hamamatsu, and Majima. They didn't know where Tristan was, or if any of the serialist heretics were still out there, but they knew one thing. They had to stop Tristan. Thank you for listening to Day 2 of Do Gods Dream of Digital Drugs? If you enjoyed this replay, do consider purchasing the Japonism scenario pack on Booth.pm, though please note that it is currently only available in Japanese. Also, as always, big thanks to CryoChamber for the use of their albums Cthulhu and Yog-Sothoth. Check the show notes for links. Until next time, have a good one. While the university had campuses all over Tokyo, the AI lab was in Bunkyoko Jinbu. Oh, fuck me, I should have practiced that beforehand, eh?